Hello, welcome back to Land Rover Toolbox videos. We had a rather leaky steering box, and we also had a ball joint on the drag link which was rather poppy. Well, here is a dead steering box we've just removed from the vehicle, and this one's a high ratio or a quick ratio add-west 4-bolt steering box. So instead of the usual 3.5 turns from lock to lock, this one should be 2.8 turns lock to lock. Okay, it's not wise to have a leaking steering box on your vehicle. Let's just check up with the law here, section 2.3 of the MOT Inspector's Manual. The method of inspection is looking for leaks in the system, and a reason for rejection would be a leak in the system showing that the component, joint or seal has failed. And it's very clear to see that the bottom seal on the steering box on our 110 has failed. Right, so we're going to remove this leaking steering box and replace it with a slightly better upgrade. Yes, there is a seal kit available for the steering box, which is provided by Bearmark. Parts is on the screen. The problem is the drop arm needs to be taken off the splines. It's not that easy. You can't just pull it off with your hand. Best way to get them off successfully is with a specialist tool, which is a puller with a hydraulic ram in it. This delivers something like 8 tons of pressure. There could be more to it than just a leaky seal. The bush might be worn, or there might be play in shaft, so we're going to leave it and put a fresh steering box on. This just saves a lot of hassle all around. Okay, so the first thing to do is remove as much of the fluid out of the reservoir as possible. Once the hydraulic circuit has been disconnected, there is still going to be quite a lot of leakage. You have a set of 3 pipe unions that are into the steering box, and you only need to remove 2 of them. First one, well, you'll need possibly a 5/8 spanner, nothing else will do, and crack that off. Remove it, and then you can use a 14mm spanner on the steel pipe. Because you've removed one, this gives you access to remove the next one. The supply and the return pipes will be full of fluid, to make sure that you collect them in some type of container, otherwise you'll be swimming in oil. You can see even after the pipes have been disconnected, every time you move the drop arm, it will push oil out of the ports. You can see that very clearly. Even with the steering box off and you think you've drained it, there will still be a lot of fluid contained in this unit. Next thing to do is to remove the drop arm ball joint, which is this one, and you can either use a specialist tool or another technique. The favourite one here really is to use a ball joint splitter. It's easy, like so. We're actually going to do the other end because we need to change some of the steering components. This taper was actually very loose here. Usually you have to put quite a bit of tension on to knock a ball joint out of its taper socket. Next thing to do is remove a steering knuckle, steering joint from the steering shaft. You need to remove these 2 bolts, which are just M8. It's quite easy to do, and they're pinch bolts. So you have a groove or a cut here, which you need to open out slightly. You can do that with a chisel in the groove. You don't need to push it too far, and like this. So you're getting it free from the splines first of all. A little bit of lubricant, which is going to free the joint off the splines, is advisable. And on the lower joint by the steering box, all you need to do is remove the pinch clamp bolt from the shaft clamp, okay? Right, so you knock the joint upwards onto the steering column shaft, and then knock the steering shaft downwards first of all, okay? Because you've removed the pinch bolt from the steering box end, this will give you more room to play with. The next thing you can do is to wiggle this and slide it down the shaft on the splines, okay? This will go. Obviously it'll be a little bit corroded, but once that's off like that, then the shaft is free. Take care not to damage any of the splines on this shaft. Right, the next thing to do is to undo these 2 bolts up here, which are nut and bolt. The next thing to do is to remove the other end of the bracket, from the panhard rod bracket which is bolted to the chassis, and you'll find that there isn't supposed to be a bush in here. This is to allow the bracket to move slightly under extreme tension. Right, so the last thing to do is to knock over the lock tabs and remove the 4 bolts on the chassis that are holding the steering box into place. You'll find possibly that this bolt here, because it's underneath the mudguard, is going to be the most awkward, but it will come out. Once those bolts are done, then the whole lot will come out. You'll notice I've actually left a few things attached to the steering box. This is just to make life easier for myself, because some of the components need to be changed. Right, once the steering box is out, you can take the lower shaft off. And again, this might be stuck because it's been pinched onto the splines. So using a chisel, just to widen it open a little bit, that should then just knock off easily. Be gentle with it because it is a UJ. Right, so we have a dead steering box here, which we're going to have to send back under replacement, and we have one here with a drop arm already fitted. If you're buying a reconditioned steering box without a drop arm, then you need to remove the retaining nut and lock plate, use a suitable tool like this one from Sykes Pickavant, and remove the drop arm, and that's without damaging either the steering box or the drop arm. With a reconditioned box, the nut is done up to 179 Newton meters and the lock tab bent back over again, like so. But what we have here, we already have a fresh ball joint and drop arm fitted, which you can buy, and to be honest with you, is probably the most economical way. 4-bolt steering box, and I'll show you that this here are the 2 pipes blanked off. You have a cap on your splines, which is just as well because you don't want them damaged, and also you have the bleed nipple, which is here on a steering box. Right, so it's a matter of reverse doing what we did to remove, which is fitting the 4 bolts first of all into place and torquing them up. The torque setting is on the screen for them. Once you've torqued them up, you then want to knock over the lock tabs to make sure that the bolts don't come undone. Loctite also stops corrosion on thread, so we're using that along with the lock tabs, which is extra security. Right, so this bracket here, okay, we're leaving that loose for now, and you can see how much play is in there. First thing we need to do with this bracket is to make sure that it's centralized in the hole here. This will find its own level eventually as the chassis moves about. Okay, so lift it up, hold it in place, and then bolt it on. I know this is cheating a little bit, but yeah, this is the modern age. Try to use new bolts wherever you can, and if not, use thread lock at least. Okay, so the bracket is called a securing tie bar, and the bolts need to be done up to 81 Newton meters along with the tie bar rod nut. Okay, the 2 nuts on the bracket need to be wound off by 1 turn. After test driving the vehicle, you can then tighten up the bracket to 81 Newton meters and then the tie rod to 110 Newton meters. This has allowed it to settle with movement from the chassis. With the steering joint here, you have a pinch bolt which needs to be able to locate in that groove. So you need to put the joint on and make sure it lines up so you can get your bolt through, otherwise it won't go through. Make sure that you use new nuts, and you can have the nuts so the nylock will fit all the way over the thread like so. The groove for the pinch bolt is also on the shaft ends and the steering column end. Fitting is the reverse of removal, and if the splines are clean it should fit together quite well, and you can bolt this all up in the vehicle. It's easier than stripping it out. Pipes are fitted back reverse of how you remove them, and just nip them up, don't over tighten them. Workshop manual sends you around the houses to centralize your steering box, but you'll notice there's a notch and a hole. Line them up and your steering box is centered. That's all you need to know. Right, so we'll pull this up to the center, and then we'll fit the drag link onto the steering arm like so. Easy enough. You put your washer on, then you put your castellated nut on, and just remember this should wind down easy enough without having any resistance. If there is, then the thread could be damaged, and you really want to clean it up before you screw the nut on, otherwise you'll be in trouble. Right then, the torque wrench setting is on the screen. According to the manual, it's 40 Newton meters. Click that off, and that's set, ready to put your split pin in. The hole, if it doesn't line up with the castellated grooves, then just move it slightly. Don't forget to bend over the split pin to finish the job off. Right, so the next thing to do is to fill up the system, or the reservoir, first. Generally it's power steering fluid, or ATF, or Dextron 2 that we're using here. And I've just been careful because the first time we do this, it's going to run straight out of the reservoir and try to fill the pipes up, which means when you first start it up, make sure that you check it again and top it up as required before you start going lock to lock. First thing you need to do is to make sure that you have your wheels off the ground and you can turn it lock to lock. And with your engine running, you're using the pump to pump the fluid around the system, around the steering box, and pushing the air out. This should be all that's needed. What you'll find first of all, that the steering's a little bit stiff and it will judder slightly as the air is being evacuated. Make sure that you keep the reservoir topped up while you're doing this as well. Possibly assistant could help you. Otherwise, just don't let the reservoir drain dry. You will see air bubbles in the fluid while you're bleeding. However, if it persists and your steering is still juddering after a while, then possibly you need to bleed up the steering box. And this is done with a pipe onto the nipple. Make sure your engine is switched off before you go into that area. You do need a pipe to be able to collect the fluid so you don't make a mess on the deck, and it will be an 11mm spanner to undo the bleed nipple. Once you have it on, and cracked off, you can then run the engine and push some of the fluid out, and you'll find that some of the air bubbles will come out and it will be okay afterwards. Just a quick lock to lock should do it, and keep an eye on the fluid as well. It does push fluid out rather quickly. Because this is so close to the pulley, switch the engine off before you do your bleed nipple back up, and you only need to nip it up with your spanner and it's okay. Right, so you shouldn't have any problems now, and you can top the reservoir up to where it needs to be. Don't overfill it because it needs some expansion as the oil gets hot, and the marker here is the maximum you can have in the reservoir. Okay, so that's done. You can then nip this up and take it for a test drive to make sure that everything's okay. One thing we haven't done is straighten the steering wheel yet, which we're going to do. However, we've just put new track rods and drag rods in, and a few other bits and pieces. So we'll be covering these pretty shortly in the next few tutorials. Until next week, I better just clean off the greasy fingerprints that are all over the door.